The sky had no right to turn black at noon, not in Jerusalem, not in the spring, and yet it did. For 3 hours, the sun refused to shine, as if creation itself could not bear to watch what was happening on a hill called the Skull. A man was dying. But before he breathed his last, he spoke 7 times, 7 sentences, fewer than 50 words in total. And 2,000 years later, scholars, skeptics, and believers are still trying to understand what those words truly meant, because hidden inside them is not the story of a man giving up, but of a king finishing something far greater than anyone standing at the foot of that cross could possibly comprehend. It began before dawn, in a garden of olive trees, where the ground was still damp with the sweat of a man who had prayed so hard his blood vessels had broken beneath his skin. By the time the sun rose over Jerusalem, Jesus of Nazareth had already been betrayed by a kiss, abandoned by his closest friends, and dragged through a night of illegal trials before men who had already decided his fate before the first witness ever spoke. The charges shifted like sand. Blasphemy one moment, treason the next. It did not matter. The verdict had been written long before the questions were asked. By the time Pontius Pilate stood before the crowd, holding his hands out in a futile gesture of innocence, the outcome was inevitable. Pilate found no fault in him. 3 times he said it, and 3 times the crowd screamed louder, "Give us Barabbas, crucify him."
And so, a Roman governor who did not believe a man was guilty ordered him beaten with a whip embedded with metal and bone, mocked with a crown twisted from thorns, and sentenced to the most agonizing form of execution the ancient world had ever devised. Crucifixion was not simply meant to kill a man, it was meant to erase him, to strip him of dignity so completely that no one would ever remember him as anything but a criminal. The condemned carried the crossbeam through the streets, and by the time Jesus reached Golgotha, he had already lost so much blood that he could no longer carry the weight alone. A stranger named Simon of Cyrene was pulled from the crowd to help, perhaps the only act of mercy shown to him since the trial began. Then came the nails. Historians and forensic experts have long debated exactly where the iron spikes were driven, through the palms as art has depicted for centuries, or through the wrists where the bones could actually bear the weight of a suspended body without tearing free. Most scholars now believe it was the latter, driven through the area of the wrist known anatomically as the space of distote, a point strong enough to hold a man upright for hours. The feet were nailed as well, often overlapping, bent at an angle that made every breath an act of excruciating will. Crucifixion kills slowly, through a combination of exhaustion, blood loss, and asphyxiation. To exhale, the victim had to push upward against the nail through his feet, dragging his torn back against the rough wood, just to expand his lungs enough to draw another breath.
Every single word Jesus spoke on that cross was not a whisper, it was a battle. Each sentence cost him something the human body was never designed to give twice, and yet he spoke 7 times. The first words came almost immediately after the nails were driven, while the sound of hammers still echoed, and the soldiers were dividing his clothing among themselves, like men splitting the spoils of an ordinary execution. Looking down at the very people driving iron through his flesh, Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Consider the audience of that sentence. Not distant strangers, not future generations reading a text centuries later. The Roman soldiers standing directly beneath him, men who had just flogged him, mocked him, and were now gambling over his last possession, his robe. These were not innocent men caught in a misunderstanding. They knew they were executing someone. And still, in the same breath that cost him blood and air, Jesus asked forgiveness for them. Theologians have spent centuries unpacking what "they know not what they do" truly means, because on the surface, the soldiers absolutely knew they were driving nails into a man's wrists. What they did not know, what none of them could possibly grasp in that moment, was the full weight of what they were participating in. They believed they were executing a Jewish rebel, accused of claiming kingship.
They had no comprehension that they were, according to the very faith this account comes from, present at the exact moment prophesied for centuries, the fulfillment of promises stretching back to a garden where humanity first broke fellowship with its Creator, Ignorance in this reading is not about the physical act, it is about the cosmic one. They knew they were killing a man. They did not know they were witnessing the hinge point of human history. There is something almost unbearable in the placement of this sentence. First, before anything else, before addressing his own pain, his own mother, his own fate. Forgiveness was not the last resort of a dying man running out of things to say. It was the first instinct of a man who had spent his entire life doing exactly this, extending mercy to the very people who least deserved it and arguably needed it most. Time moved differently on that hill. The crowd that had screamed for his execution now stood watching, some in confusion, others already restless, waiting for the spectacle to end. On either side of Jesus, two other men hung on their own crosses, criminals, the gospel accounts tell us, condemned for their own crimes, whatever they may have been. One of them joined the chorus of mockery drifting up from the crowd below. "If you are the Messiah, save yourself and us." But the other one did something unexpected. He rebuked his fellow criminal, acknowledging that their own punishment was just, while this man beside them had done nothing wrong.
And then, in what might be one of the most remarkable declarations of faith recorded in any ancient text, this dying criminal turned his head toward Jesus and said simply, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." Understand what this man was asking. He was not asking for healing. He was not asking to be spared from death. That ship had long since sailed for both of them. He was asking to be remembered by a man who, by every visible measure, appeared to be losing, beaten, bleeding, nailed to wood, hours from death. And yet this criminal looked past all of that and saw something else entirely, a king, even in defeat, a kingdom, even in apparent collapse. Jesus turned to him and delivered the second of his 7 sayings. "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Not someday, not after a long wait in some intermediate state. Today. A promise of immediate presence, immediate restoration, immediate belonging, extended not to a religious leader, not to a lifelong follower, not to someone who had earned it through decades of devotion, but to a criminal in his final hours, whose only qualification was recognizing who was hanging beside him. It is, in many respects, the most radical sentence spoken that entire day. It suggested that access to whatever lay beyond death was not a reward for accumulated righteousness, but a gift extended freely, even in the final moments of a wasted life. Below the cross, a small group had gathered who had not fled. John, the youngest of the 12 disciples, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Jesus' own mother, a woman named Mary, who now stood watching her son die in the most public, humiliating way the empire could devise. Whatever prophecy she had heard decades earlier that a sword would pierce her own soul was being fulfilled in real time, in front of her eyes, on a hill outside the city walls. Jesus looked down at her, then at John standing beside her, and spoke his third sentence, a fragmented sequence directed first to his mother, then to his disciple. "Woman, here is your son." Then to John, "Here is your mother." On its surface, this looks like a simple act of filial responsibility, a dying son making sure his widowed mother would be cared for after his death, since tradition holds that Joseph, her husband, had already passed away years earlier, leaving Jesus as the eldest son responsible for her well-being. But look closer, and the weight of the moment expands. Even in the middle of unimaginable physical agony, even while executing what many believers consider the single most important act in human history, Jesus paused to attend to the ordinary, human, domestic need of making sure his mother would not be left alone. Cosmic significance and human tenderness occurring in the very same breath. Hours passed. The sun that had blazed at noon vanished behind darkness that swallowed the land, a darkness ancient historians outside the biblical text also recorded, though their explanations for it varied. Some spoke of it as an unusual eclipse, though a solar eclipse cannot occur during a full moon, which the Passover season always was, making the astronomical explanation deeply unsatisfying to modern researchers who have studied it. Whatever the cause, the darkness lasted roughly 3 hours, from what would be noon until 3 in the afternoon, and it was near the end of this darkness that Jesus spoke again, but this time the sentence was different from everything that came before it. "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani," he cried out, Aramaic words meaning, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
This fourth saying has troubled and fascinated readers for 2,000 years because it appears, at first glance, to be a cry of absolute despair from a man who believed himself abandoned by God at the exact moment he needed divine presence the most. Some of the bystanders, hearing the Aramaic word for God, Eli, mistakenly thought he was calling for the prophet Elijah and paused to see if Elijah would descend to rescue him. A moment of dark, almost tragic confusion, layered on top of an already unbearable scene. But there is another layer entirely beneath this cry, one that many casual readers miss entirely. These words are not original to Jesus in that moment. They are the opening line of Psalm 22, an ancient Hebrew poem written roughly 1,000 years earlier by King David, a psalm that begins in utter anguish and desolation, but ends in triumphant vindication and praise.
In the culture of that time and place, quoting the first line of a psalm was often understood as invoking the entire psalm, its full arc, from despair to deliverance. Psalm 22 describes, with haunting specificity, details that mirror crucifixion itself: the piercing of hands and feet, the casting of lots for garments, the mockery of onlookers wagging their heads, written centuries before crucifixion was even practiced as a form of execution. By crying out the opening of this psalm, Jesus may have been doing something far more layered than expressing simple despair. He may have been identifying himself publicly with the entire prophetic arc of that ancient psalm, from abandonment to ultimate victory, even as he hung dying. And yet, we cannot strip away the raw, human agony embedded in those words either. This was not theater. Whatever theological layers exist beneath the surface, in that moment, Jesus experienced something that the text presents as genuine and devastating: a sense of separation from the Father, with whom he had always known perfect, unbroken unity. Many theologians describe this as the moment when the full weight of human sin was placed upon him, resulting in an experience of divine forsakenness that, according to this belief system, no other human being would ever have to fully endure, because he endured it completely on their behalf. Not long after this cry, Jesus spoke his fifth sentence, a single word in the original Greek, dipso, I thirst.
After hours without water, after blood loss that would have left any human being in profound physiological shock, after breathing that required a monumental act of will with every single inhale, thirst would have been an agonizing, all-consuming sensation. Soldiers, hearing this, soaked a sponge in sour wine, a cheap vinegar-like drink common among Roman soldiers, and lifted it to his lips on a stalk of hyssop, a plant with deep symbolic roots in Jewish tradition, used centuries earlier to apply the blood of a sacrificial lamb to doorframes on the night the Israelites were spared from the final plague in Egypt before their exodus from slavery. Whether the soldiers understood the symbolism of the plant they reached for is unknowable, but for those who trace the threads of this story back through the Hebrew scriptures, offering hyssop to the very sacrifice believed to have ended the need for all future sacrifices is almost too poetic to be coincidental. This fifth saying is often noted by scholars as confirmation of the sheer physical humanity of Jesus during this ordeal. Whatever else was happening on a spiritual or cosmic level, his body was a real human body, suffering real human dehydration, real human exhaustion, real human pain. There is no room in the crucifixion narrative for a version of Jesus who was merely appearing to suffer, floating above the agony untouched. The account insists again and again on the total, unglamorous physical reality of what he endured. By now, the hours were closing in on their end.
The darkness that had covered the land for 3 hours was beginning to lift, and Jesus, gathering what little strength remained in a body ravaged by blood loss and exhaustion, spoke his sixth sentence, 3 words that would echo through every century that followed. It is finished. In the original Greek, this phrase is a single word, tetelestai, and it carried a meaning far beyond simple exhaustion or resignation. This was not a man saying, "I am finished," in the sense of being defeated or destroyed. Tetelestai was a word used in that era on completed business transactions and receipts, stamped across a debt once it had been paid in full. It was used by craftsmen when a task had been executed perfectly, with nothing left undone. It was, in essence, a declaration of completed mission, not surrendered life. Consider everything this single word was meant to encompass, according to the beliefs surrounding this narrative. Centuries of prophecy, going back to promises made in a garden after humanity's first failure, promises repeated to a wandering nomad named Abraham, to a fugitive shepherd named Moses, to a shepherd-turned-king named David, to prophets who spoke of a suffering servant who would be pierced for the transgressions of others. All of it in this belief system, converging into a single moment on a hill outside Jerusalem, culminating in one word that declared the entire arc of that story, finally, fully, irreversibly complete. Not abandoned, not cut short, finished, as in fulfilled. The final sentence came moments later, as the last of his strength gave way.
Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. This seventh and final saying is once again drawn directly from the Hebrew Scriptures, specifically Psalm 31, another ancient song of trust amid suffering. And notice the tone of this final sentence compared to the fourth one, the cry of forsakenness. Where the fourth saying expressed the agony of separation, this seventh and final saying expressed complete, restored trust, a son returning to his father, an act of total surrender, not defeat, but deliberate release. According to the account, no one took his life from him in that final moment. He gave it up, willingly, into hands he trusted completely, even after the darkest hours any human being has ever been asked to endure. And then, the text tells us, he breathed his last. In that instant, according to the Gospel accounts, the curtain in the temple in Jerusalem, an enormous, heavily woven barrier separating the inner sanctuary, the space believed to house the very presence of God, from the rest of the temple, tore violently from top to bottom. Not bottom to top, as one might expect from human hands attempting to force entry, but from the top down, suggesting, to those who recorded it, an act of divine origin rather than human tampering. The earth shook. Tombs, according to the account, broke open.
A Roman centurion standing at the foot of the cross, a man whose entire career had been built on presiding over executions, looked up at what he had just witnessed and reportedly declared, "Surely this man was the Son of God." Words from the very soldier tasked with confirming his death, perhaps the most unlikely witness of all. 2,000 years later, these 7 sentences remain among the most studied, dissected, and debated words in human history. Skeptics point to inconsistencies in the various gospel accounts, noting that no single account records all 7 sayings, and that scholars have had to compile them from 4 separate narratives written decades after the events they describe, raising honest questions about historical reconstruction and the reliability of ancient testimony passed down through oral tradition before ever being written. Historians outside the Christian tradition, including Roman and Jewish sources such as Tacitus and Josephus, do independently confirm that a man named Jesus existed and was executed under Pontius Pilate, lending historical weight to the core event, even among those who reject its theological interpretation entirely. But for those who accept the account as it stands, these 7 sentences form something extraordinary, not the disjointed ramblings of a man in his final agony, but a structured, deliberate arc. Forgiveness for his enemies, salvation for a dying criminal, provision for his mother, the full weight of human separation from God, the raw admission of human thirst and suffering, the triumphant declaration of a finished mission,
and finally, complete trust and surrender into the hands of the Father. Whatever one believes about the theological claims woven through this account, it is difficult to deny the sheer weight of what unfolded on that hill outside Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago. A man, nailed to wood, using his final agonizing breaths not to curse his executioners, not to beg for mercy, not to rage against the injustice of it all, but to forgive, to promise, to provide, to endure, to declare victory, and finally, to surrender in peace. The sky went dark, the earth shook, and 7 sentences, spoken in the space of 6 agonizing hours, would go on to shape the beliefs, the art, the music, the laws,
and the moral imagination of billions of people across every continent for the next 2 millennia. Words spoken by a dying man on a Roman cross, still being studied, still being debated, still changing lives, 2,000 years after the last breath left his body.